Thank thank you, Scott. I'll mention Crystal City is going to be at the Aspen Film Festival in the next week or so. So if you're in that area, check it out. It's the Recovery Film Festival too, which is kind of cool. So hi, everybody. Always great to be here, especially if the technology is working well, and it is. I just got back from Los Angeles, as you might have heard me say, a week on the unit, which I always love. But I always, being in groups with the guys every day and hanging around them a lot, I just was reminded of how much shame plays a role in early recovery, and well, it plays a role in all our addictions, but how it can really kind of derail people there because it's such an overwhelming, strong feeling. So I wanted to kind of talk about some ways I have found that are useful to deal with shame, because shame is something that really can be crippling. It's something that we as addicts and probably partners too, but most human beings, let me say that, have, long before, I'll speak as an addict, long before I ever picked up drinks or drugs, I was riddled with shame. And I think in many ways, shame contributes to the development of addiction. So I think it's really important to kind of look at strategies. Shame is something we have to address. It's something that is there. And it's something that really is, I always tell my clients that you weren't really responsible for having that shame kind of heaped onto you, but you are responsible for kind of getting rid of it. And that's the unfortunate part of that. But those are some of the tools I want to talk about tonight. Really quickly though, first, just what is shame? There's a guy, I have a couple quotes here and it tells you how long shame has been under the scrutiny, because the first one is from Carl Jung, who was a disciple of Sigmund Freud. So you can know how far that goes. But I love what he said. He said, shame is a soul-crushing emotion. And it's true. When we start to identify with that shame and live from that place, it really is devastating for how we view ourselves and how we interact with the world. The other one, much more fast forward in the modern era, another favorite of mine, Brene Brown, who of course has done a lot of work with shame, but she talks about the difference between shame and guilt. There's the difference between I am bad and I did something bad. And I think we often hear this, I often hear with my clients when I ask them kind of what their core beliefs are. Very often it's I'm flawed, I'm unlovable, I'm unworthy. And the most devastating one that I hear a lot from chemsex users, people, typically men, but it could be women, that have both the drug and the sex addiction, that I feel like damaged goods. There's just so much wrong with me that nobody ever's going to love me, nobody's ever going to want me, and that's kind of the place that a lot of people start their journey in recovery from. So, we also know that there's this sense shame is there's something, not that I did something like guilt, but I am flawed. I am somehow defective. I've heard people actually say that word. The other thing, just to mention that we see our clients, and anybody who's been around an addict can see, there's something called a shame spiral. And that's when the shame just starts to take off and we get caught in these looping thoughts in our heads, and they just kind of pull us down into this pit of often victimhood, self-pity. There's a lot of unappealing things there that go with that shame spiral, but it really is something that can paralyze. So all that said, what can we do? The first thing I think is always important is to really recognize the triggers. Shame is not random. When shame is fired up, right? When it's triggered, when it happens, that's not just a random event. We learn to have shame reaction in response to something that triggers a belief about it, usually a negative belief about ourselves or memories of a past incident or something that can, and it can be a physical reaction, it can be an emotional reaction. It just triggers it. So I think the first step of all this is to really recognize those triggers. And I think really look at behaviors and look at the way you may react to emotional pain or to upset or to perceived rejection, right? Those are the kind of areas where we're so vulnerable. And then see, am I reacting with shame? Or am I reacting with some other feeling? Hurt, loss, sadness, indignation, whatever. But I think a lot of times the default reaction oftentimes is shame. And then, but the important thing about that is just ask yourself, what just happened? You have to really, it means you have to notice what's going on, but what just happened? What triggered that shame? And in that way, we can start to piece together these, almost like a map of how we're wired, if you will. And it gives us some targets to go back and work on with ourselves, with our meditation, with our therapist, about how to deal with that. And I'll talk more about those things in a minute. So, just ask yourself, did someone say something to make yourself feel vulnerable? Did that remind you of a way you've been rejected in the past, by your spouse or by your family or by your parents or whoever, by bullies, by your church? There's all kinds of ways we can get into this space. So, and that ability to kind of recognize triggers, I use the therapeutic concept called the observer self. And that's where we can kind of just imagine if we can kind of take ourselves out of ourselves for a moment and move 6 or 10 feet away and look back and watch ourselves. So almost watching yourself basically with some objectivity. That's what we want to get. So we're not caught up in the reaction itself, but we're kind of standing outside it, watching that. And in those ways, we can really learn a lot. Okay. The second thing, challenge those thoughts. These shame and the beliefs that it teaches us about ourselves, those are not the truth. And many addicts believe they are the truth because they often they learned those things when they were kids, and kids don't have the wiring to refute stuff. So I really look at thoughts and how they work, revisit situations where shame is reinforced, as I said, using that observer self, and overall challenge the thoughts. And that really starts to weaken the grip that shame has on us. And I've talked to you before about negativity bias, how addicts are tend to see the glass half full in almost every circumstance. And I think this can feed that too, and challenge that negativity, right, in yourself. The critical voice that always is chattering in our ear. And I think that self-talk is what it's called. Don't believe it, challenge it. I think we often assume it's true. The third one, and this is where it starts to get into practicing with other people. I think we have to learn how to receive, and how to receive especially love and kindness. And I see this all the time in group, and it was vivid to me this past week out at the unit in LA, where somebody would do something really noteworthy or praiseworthy or laudable, or be honest with themselves, maybe for the first time in a long time, if ever, right? And the group of the peers, the therapists will give them a compliment. We'll say that you did a great job. Boy, you had some good insight. And I think, and I've been in this place myself, every addict I know, and probably a lot of humans who aren't addicts, when someone says something kind to us, if it doesn't match these core beliefs I have about myself, that I'm a damaged person and really no good and unworthy and unlovable, if somebody says something nice to me, chances are I'm going to reject what they just said, because it doesn't seem real. It doesn't resonate with who I know that I am inside. And so I think what we have to do oftentimes is to just sit with it, say thank you, and just sit with it and learn how to receive it. And it's very often the way we can heal the shame that we have inside is by starting to hear those affirming messages from other people outside of ourselves. But we have to believe them when they happen. And that can be a little bit. So don't reject kindness, right? Accept it with gratitude. And that's why I say just a simple thank you will do. You don't have to say, not so much. And if you only knew, no, don't do any of that stuff. Just accept it. A couple other things. And this is a little bit down the road, but I think it's important when we're trying to understand shame, we need to revisit our childhood. And I think oftentimes that should be done, at least for people who are attending this webinar, in the context of a therapist visit. There are trauma therapists. I think trauma work is almost always a part of recovery, because we have to go back at some point when we're ready and start to look at that stuff and undo and unlearn maybe some messages we got from people that were pretty harmed themselves, right? That were not the healthiest people, or may have passed on their stuff, projected their stuff onto us as kids. But so that takes a lot of untangling. And it's a really important thing. We talk a lot about at Seeking Integrity about dependency needs, which are the needs children have that they can't meet for themselves, food, shelter, love, warmth, protection. And when those aren't met consistently when we're kids, that kind of skews us off into a whole different world of shame and negative core beliefs and stuff. So really go back and start to exploring that, looking at those patterns. And I know almost always those kind of addictive, trauma patterns can lead to addiction later in life. So now one thing about trauma therapy, I do MDR, I do hypnotherapy, I do a lot of trauma therapy myself. What I know is that if I start doing trauma therapy a couple of weeks into somebody's early recovery, it's going to end badly, because people in early recovery, they've used their addiction as their coping mechanism. And if we at Seeking Integrity or anywhere else take that coping mechanism away, we can't expect them to start digging into really painful emotional stuff without some new tools, right? And so we have to give people time to have those new tools. Two more, and then they're really kind of part A and part B of the same thought. But the first one is practice self-compassion, and the second one is practice self-forgiveness. I think this is where we start to really be kinder and gentler toward ourselves, right? And I know when I feel shamed about myself, it's really hard to view myself with compassion or with kindness. And I think that's where it really is important. But I always ask my clients, talk to yourself when you're or thinking about yourself or handling yourself as if you were talking to a beloved child or someone you really cared about, right? Because I think sometimes we're really brutal on ourselves and we're not kind to ourselves. So I just pretend that some part of you at least is a cherished person that should be respected and valued. And that self-compassion, by the way, is the antidote to all that self-criticism that comes with shame. Self-compassion and gratitude are two huge tools in this. And finally, to practice forgiveness. This is something down the road. I like metaphors in my therapeutic work, but I talk about washing away the badness, right? Kind of getting rid of that, learning to feel good about yourself, accepting yourself as being flawed. Yeah, we are flawed people, right? We do mistakes. That doesn't mean necessarily that we're bad people or that we should be riddled with shame. And I also try then to convert the shame into empathy for me, empathy for other people who are struggling, and gratitude, because for me at least, people held that space that I was an okay person and not a terrible damaged goods person until I could really believe that for myself. And so I think that's an incredibly generous act to do that for other people, in your recovery groups, if we can hold that space for them, because I know I've been there. They're not believing that they're decent people in the beginning. But it just takes time and gratitude and patience. So a couple things to talk about shame and the tools to get rid of it. And I think I'll stop with that. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Obviously, we're talking about shame today. Type your questions into the Q&A feature about shame or anything else you want to have answered. We got a couple there already, but I've got a couple of questions to get us started. Can shame ever be a positive force in terms of addiction recovery or just healing from past trauma? Can shame ever be positive, or is it always toxic?
Yeah, I think the shame that is rooted in our past and our core beliefs about ourselves, in my opinion, just kind of get in the way of recovery because it's a real obstacle. But if we take a step back out of that particular context, shame itself has a little bit of a role in that it helps keep us on our path of integrity and our moral stuff, right? I think it means that we're judging our behavior, and I think the problem with that is when it becomes kind of pathological and not based in reality. But I think once I'm in recovery, once I'm trying to live a program in a life of recovery and integrity, I think if I feel ashamed about doing something, then I don't necessarily feel I'm a bad person. It's an opportunity to go back and look at my behavior. It's like, what did I just do? So it's an inner sense, and I think we don't want to lose that, right? Because that's kind of an important data source of our behavior. But I separate that from that kind of pathological shame that's so crippling.
So this takes us back to the Brene Brown distinction. I did something bad versus I am bad.
Right.
Yeah, I always describe shame as sort of quicksand. If I'm bad, inherently bad and flawed, what's the point? So I just get sucked down into bad behaviors. Whereas if I can look at it as I made a mistake and then I can have a chance to behave differently. So
Exactly. Yeah.
One more quick one. I've got a bunch, but we're getting questions in the Q&A. Go ahead and type them in. We'll get to a lot of them today. Is it possible for an addict to be so shame-based that they absolutely can't recover? Or do you believe everybody can, if they are willing, overcome shame and then recover? Because you definitely have to overcome the shame to fully recover, I think. And comment on that too.
I think I want to believe that almost everybody can overcome those wells of shame. I think I've seen cases where people have been so traumatized, or you have some other kind of disorder or some kind of personality disorder where that can interfere. But I hope, and I could work on the philosophy that everybody has the potential to recover. And I think, nobody's born with shame. Shame is not something that, like, as a condition you're born with and have to deal with the rest of your life. Shame is taught to us by people in power in our lives, right? Whether it's our parents or the church or laws or bullies, or all that stuff gets imposed on us. And so I think we can unlearn it. Now the impact of that. So if you get someone who has a pretty, not to get into jargony talk here, but that has poor ego strength, meaning they don't have a good sense of themselves anyway. If they have a lot of shame and trauma in their past, they may have a much harder time digging out from under that and really seeing themselves with any worth and value than somebody else. But I think for the most part, with patience and time and the right therapist, you can make incredible progress, enough at least to make recovery possible for anybody who really puts the effort into.
So do you think maybe some people use it as an excuse to just avoid doing the work? Because I've had people just drop out. I've seen people just drop out. Oh no, I can't recover. And I always wonder if they're using shame as an excuse, or if the shame is just so deep that, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's why it's important to surround ourselves with people who are in a different headspace than we are, and recovery is a great place to do that. But if we're so entrenched into that, I'm damaged goods, I'm flawed, and sometimes there's payoffs for those beliefs too, right? That victimhood goes with that, I think, sometimes in some places, and a lot of us get trapped into kind of feeling like we're a victim. We can't see the reality of it, or at least see the role that we play in those situations. So I think there's circumstances like that, but I do think that with the right support, almost everybody can make progress out of that, for sure. And, there's something called secondary gains, right? Where if people, I roll around in my shame like I would in mud, just kind of covering myself in it and kind of writhing in it in my discomfort and pain, but not moving out of it, and not doing anything to change it. And I think that's where people sometimes need a little bit of a push, or a different therapeutic approach, besides just being encouraging and soft, which is kind of a little bit of a harder. That's where a sponsor might come in and give a kick. But yeah.
Okay. All right, let's jump to the Q&A feature. My husband has been in recovery for 3 years. He still displays shame, and he also still displays some addict behaviors. The addict behaviors include little lies, defensiveness, etc. Can this change over time? And are these behaviors shame-based, or is he not fully embracing recovery? Great question.
Great question. Well, first of all, 3 years, that's a long time to stay engaged, right? And that's good. We've talked here before about how certain kind of behaviors persist and slowly fade, lying being one of those, unfortunately. I think those shame reactions also could fall into that category. It's so hardwired in how people think and view themselves and view the world that sometimes it's really hard to see any other reality. And that's where I think patience, support from peers, kind of remodeling, and a willingness on the part of the person to make the changes. As I said, there is sometimes what we call secondary gain. People kind of hang on to it for various reasons. And I think that can be there. But I think the piece, and I don't know if your husband is in therapy or not, but I think probably when I see residuals like this, little pockets of shame that kind of won't go away, and it's those little behaviors, I don't mean to minimize it, like lying, significant behaviors that should fade over time. We really have to take that seriously and look at that. And I think a lot of that can be cleaned up in therapy, because I think there's only, we've said many times, 12-step groups and therapy are two different things, right? And 12-step groups can do a lot, incredible things, but they're not therapy, and people sometimes need, almost always probably need both. And so I think, yeah, to answer this question, I think they absolutely can change over time. I would guess these are probably a combination of old ways of thinking that are kind of shame defined, but also there may be some resistance to embracing recovery. I think it's almost never one or the other. It's probably usually a blend of those. But I would encourage him to go in therapy, to kind of recommit maybe to what he's doing for recovery activities, and really look at that.
Yeah, it's interesting with this question, because when I teach the online work groups and we cover denial, and I know we do the same at Seeking Integrity Los Angeles, our treatment center, I always start the lecture with a discussion of shame. Because denial comes from shame. The lies and the secrets come from shame. If I don't want you to know the real me, because the real me is awful in my mind. So that's why I tell lies and keep secrets. So yeah, this is definitely a shame-based behavior. I do hope it's getting slightly better as time progresses. And eventually maybe it'll all be gone. How can I take steps?
Before you go on, I'm sorry. I just want to really underscore a line you just said, we're talking with the clients about this as well, because people say, why do I lie when I don't even have to? Where are these lies coming from? And you just said it, Scott. Lies are connected to shame. If I'm afraid to tell you what's really going on with me, and that becomes a way of life for the addict, then just these lies come out just to deflect and put up kind of a force field so you don't get near me. Really important point.
Yeah, I'm not going to let you know anything about me, even the stuff that's not bad, just because I'm too scared. Okay, how can I take steps to restore connection with my wife after an intense conversation or a triggering moment where I think I've caused more harm? My wife withdraws, and I don't know what to say or do to start the process of mending the lost ground. Saying I'm sorry is like pouring gasoline on the flame, but my inaction looks like I don't care, or I'm not willing to take responsibility, when in fact I just don't know what to do, or at least I don't know what to do that won't make it worse. Another great question.
Right, for sure. Couple of things. I think when people are triggered, as your wife is in these circumstances, it can happen to everybody and does frequently. But when people are triggered, they react often in their old ways of reacting. We see this very, very often with couples in recovery. One or the other will, or both, will often react when things get heated, when things get emotional, when the temperature goes up, when there's arguing. They might react as they might have way back as kids, right? We've had a lot of guys who come through Seeking Integrity who talk about kind of getting that deer in the headlights look when their wife yells at them, because it reminds them of how their dad used to yell at them, right? So there's a lot of and these are automatic reactions. I'm not making excuses, but these are reactions, and both spouses and addicts have them. So what people need to do on both sides of that is to really practice self-care. And almost always people need a break, right? And it's okay. I need 5 minutes or 10 minutes to go breathe, call my sponsor, take a walk, whatever, just to kind of rebalance. But the important thing is to re-engage. And so one suggestion I would have when you guys are not in a heated moment, when things are calm and you feel connected, is to maybe talk about some structure or ground rules or whatever you want to call it to handle situations like that. And one of the important aspects, I think, of that would be a commitment to come back, to re-engage when those things happen on both parties. And so that's one thing, and that's harder to do sometimes than it's easier to say. But I think it's really important that people just don't retreat to their corners and don't come back, right? If you really want to work on recovery, you have to re-engage, and that's often the way to create that structure. Is not in the heat of the moment, but when things are better. The other thing I often find is really useful to kind of bridge this is daily check-ins, right? And that can be, there's many different structures and outlines, Vanos and a number of others. But I think that daily connection where you just kind of share what's going on, and not every maybe gruesome detail, but in how your day's been, if you've had challenges, how you dealt with it, and all that transparency in your process starts to, I think, build the trust that people may not be having. Now, that said, people are going to get triggered, people are going to get hurt. So I think just to really have some kind of agreement to re-engage when it happens. One of the very things that are so harmful is when, and this is usually based on patterns, when the addiction was active, where people wouldn't finish, they wouldn't come back, right? You get an argument and you blow out, or you disengage and it never gets resolved, it just kind of builds and rolls forward. So those kind of patterns, we definitely want to break. So I think, first of all, I really appreciate your sensitivity to this and your desire to figure out or understand what you can do to make it better. I think that's really huge. And you're right. I think inaction doesn't look good. And so what I would say, if you haven't established those things I was talking about, it to re-engage and plan, give her some time, not too long, May, and then you can't fix it, you can't inquire, you can't overplay your hand, if you will. But I think what you can do is suggest to her that that certainly wasn't your intention to cause some kind of upset, and that you are available to speak whenever she's ready. I think that's really important, that you're not pushing it, you're not, so she's on her timetable, she has every right to do that. But I think it's important to state your readiness to talk about it and your availability. That's another key piece.
Yeah, just your willingness and awareness is wonderful. The techniques will come. This next question, there's a sentence and there's a question. And I'm hoping we can address both the sentence and the question. So the sentence is, my sex addict husband doesn't exhibit shame. And then the question is, shouldn't he have some shame?
Wow. Okay. Wow. A couple of thoughts. So yeah, shame is a human condition. When people don't have shame, I want to ask more questions about what's going on there, because sometimes people who lack remorse, lack compassion, lack other kinds of things, also lack shame. And that can be an indicator of perhaps more serious issues sometimes. So I think that
can I take the other half of that, which is,
yeah, of course.
A lot of times people exhibit shame by getting really narcissistic or really exhibiting a lot of bravado, or it's all under control. That's also a shame reaction. That's how I was reading it. But yeah, you're reading it as some people actually don't have shame and they have real problems. But anyway, so sorry, back to you.
Yes. So, and a lot of people, there's a rule in their head that shame is not safe or okay, or it's not okay to even exhibit that. And so there's defenses against shame, right? So you may be, your husband may be feeling shame, but it's being camouflaged, if you will, or defended against with other behaviors, like Scott just said, being very narcissistic, being very entitled, being very grandiose, being very demanding. It's kind of the flip side of shame, if you will, but it's a way of in the person's mind counteracting the extreme negative they're feeling. So, what a great opportunity for some cool discussions between the two of you, I think, to talk about this, because I think he may be feeling shame, and it's being kind of camouflaged in a way that you're not recognizing, or he may not. He might not be feeling it. So, which I think is probably less likely, far less likely. So anyway, this might be something that you guys can talk about between the two of you, or to take it into your CSAT's office and talk about it in the context of therapy. I think that kind of discussion will be hugely informative and powerful in terms of just growth and movement, because your observation is a good one, right? You're noticing that, hey, this should be maybe here and shouldn't. So I'd bring it to a context if you guys are uncomfortable talking about it between the two of yourselves, take it to your therapist and have a session talking about that. I think it'll be very productive.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Hello, Dr. Fawcett. How do you deal with shame right after acting out? How do we stop the shame spiral and move toward curiosity and calm? And for those of you who don't know, the cycle of addiction, it starts, we get triggered, and then we go into fantasy and we do some ritualization. We start taking steps toward acting out. Then we act out, and then we come back around and we hit this stage, which we call remorse. And it's often just this massive shame dump. Because, oh my God, I just did it again. So I think this question is about that shame dump right after we act out. So how do you deal with that, Dave?
Right. So it's a natural part of that addictive process, right? And what a lot of people do is deal with it in the wrong way. They'll deal with the symptom. And so very often we see sex and porn and chemsex addicts or intensity addicts going toward substances and behaviors that are more soothing, that aren't necessarily intensity based, but more kind of numbing based, right? So going for alcohol or benzodiazepines or sleeping medication or food or complex carbohydrates or that kind of soothing, binging on TV, just anything to kind of shut down and numb.
So it's almost another cycle of addiction that spins off in another direction. So instead of a cycle, we've got a figure eight where we're going around.
Exactly right. And so that's one way that often people do deal with that. I think what I found, and this is where, again, connection is so important. We can't do it by ourselves. Or the way we can release shame is really to talk about it and to share it and get support from people. And it's every group of clients we have who come through, we always have to ask them and encourage them, in fact, to leave as many kind of secrets behind as they can, because secrets really feed that shame, and it's all one part of one big system. And they're always, every one of them has stuff. I'm going to take this one to my grave, and they end up sharing in a group, and then fear, drop into shame immediately, thinking everybody's judging them, shaming them, thinking they're horrible people, and almost universally the reaction is compassion, right, or at least understanding, or being gentle. And with a gentle maybe push to say, well, look at what your role in that. Don't dismiss your role. Don't take any responsibility from it. But let's approach it from a different angle besides the lens of shame, and to perhaps the lens of guilt. Guilt being something like Brene Brown says, something I did, not something I am. And so I think the biggest thing, we've talked about that here too, is just sunlight, right? Getting it out, getting into daylight. And putting it out there and seeing what it feels like afterwards. I think that's hugely important. So to answer your question more directly, if you're in that space at the end of a cycle of relapse and an addiction, and you're feeling that intense feeling of shame and dropping that shame spiral, and it's probably the last thing you want to do, but I really encourage you to reach out, make a call, get to a meeting, talk about it. And I guarantee you'll feel better. And this is, we talked about the kind of different kinds of shame. This is the shame that it's not doing any good. People start to ruminate, and they get shame about feeling shame. I mean, it just kind of builds and compounds and can be quite paralyzing. So the best thing, drag it out in the daylight, talk about it. I know your worst fears are that it'll just make it worse, and everybody knows what a horrible person you are. But believe me, it'll be quite the opposite.
Yeah.
Scott, you teach us a lot and have a lot of experience with it. Anything else to add to that? I'm curious.
No, I mean, I totally agree. You got to talk about it. If you come clean after a slip or a relapse, if you come clean, it will immediately help with the shame. If you don't come clean, not only does it not help with the shame, you got an extra layer of secrets, and it just compounds the shame and makes it worse. You got to come clean. So yes, please talk about it. Why do active porn addicts and sex addicts sometimes stop using for a period of time? Is that related to feeling shameful? Yep. Yep.
Yes. Yeah, of course. I think every addict is probably often dismayed, if not shocked at their behavior, and knows at some level. And most addicts often, sadly, become kind of numb to the emotional damage they're doing to the people around them. Obviously, we see that all the time with betrayed spouses, the addict might know, if it even occurs to them, that this would be really harmful, but they're not feeling it. And I think sometimes when people have that shame, at least there's a little bit of awareness there. Oh boy, I just really messed up. And so it's very common for a while in that, and it's real, understanding the addictive cycle is really important, because at the end of that addictive cycle, the dopamine's kind of spent, the appeal is gone, the reward is gone, if you will, and we're just left with the wreckage of whatever we just did, right? Both internally to ourselves and out there in the world. And that's where the shame can come in. But so it's not unusual then for people to say, whoa, I'm never going to do that again. I got to back off. This is horrible. How could I do that? And by the way, that's when I think the addict is teachable. If I want to intervene on somebody and try to get into make a difference and interrupt their pattern, those are the moments when they're feeling awful about what they just did, that they can hear something, they can listen, but then it kind of closes up again. And what happens typically, and this is why they've stopped for a while perhaps and then start again, after a while, that the dismay about what they did kind of fades, and more importantly, the addictive impulse starts to grow. And that can be sexual desire, it can be the craving for a drug or acting out, but suddenly the appeal of the addictive behavior starts to outweigh the need to never do that again. And so we see very quickly people doing this flip-flop where they'll go through periods of not acting out, usually at the end of their addictive cycle, and then over time they'll pick it up again. As you guys know, I've worked with chemsex for 30 years. This is the pattern, right? People will act out, they'll use cocaine or methamphetamine or sex or any drug and sexual behavior or porn, they act out, they feel terrible, and then they say, God, I'll never do that again. And then that can go on a while, but when the sexual desire starts to come back, usually people don't know how to deal with that in a healthy way, and then they're off and running again. So we do see this pattern of interruption, even what we call sexual anorexia, where people just stay away from sex. And sometimes they do that as a coping mechanism, because every time they try to engage in sex, they relapse or they lose control. And so it's a strategy sometimes, but I think it's also almost an inherent part of the addictive cycle, that kind of periods of not acting out, sometimes driven by shame, but often by that end of that addictive cycle where they just kind of their bodies are kind of waiting to start the whole thing over again.
Yeah. And, there are other reasons for this, but I mean, in my personal experience, I would get like really disgusted with myself and I would white knuckle it for a while and stay sober for a while. But other reasons, getting in a new relationship or getting engaged or getting married. I don't want to, be that guy. So, I'll be sober for a little while. But like David said, unless we address the addiction is still there. So whatever the reason for these periods of sobriety, and they can be short, they can be long, sometimes, not feeling well, sometimes, super busy with a new job, it can put the addiction kind of on the shelf for a little while. But unless the addiction is addressed, it's going to come back.
Right. We see this a lot too, as you just said, Scott, where people will say get married and assume, well, now that I'm married, I won't need to look at porn anymore, or have a baby, or do whatever to kind of consolidate the marriage. And that stuff doesn't work, unfortunately. It's kind of what we tell ourselves, the kind of magical thinking, but the addiction's not going to go away that easily.
How do you stop shame-driven thinking without overanalyzing every thought or action? A great question. How do we stop the shame without overanalyzing it?
Right. I guess what comes to mind for me on that question is, if I'm in my own head and I'm the only data source for processing my shame, I'm probably going to spin around and overanalyze it. In fact, I guarantee that I will. The way we can break that cycle and kind of guarantee that we don't is to bring other people into it. I think only by doing that, where we can get outside objective opinions and feedback and support, is it going to kind of not get overanalyzed, right? If we talked earlier a couple minutes ago about dragging this stuff out into the sunshine, and that's really a way of kind of trying to enforce some objectivity on it, get feedback on it. But it's the nature of shame it's a ruminative kind of thing. So if I'm spinning around in shame and my negative thoughts and my negative beliefs about myself and all the bad stuff I've done and what a horrible person I am, and that becomes an obsessive thought. And I think people just kind of spin around with that and they ruminate on it and it doesn't go anywhere. And that's not productive. But I think that's the difference. I think if we're in our own heads by ourselves, then we're probably going to spin around. So if you're caught in that, I would encourage you to pick up a phone and call your sponsor or call a friend and talk about it, because that, I guarantee, will help that almost by definition.
Yeah, somebody told me early in recovery, stay out of your head. It's a dangerous neighborhood. Don't go there alone.
Don't ever go there alone. Exactly. Yeah. So, yeah.
Especially at night, because I can really spin at night.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Is there a sharp transition from being shame-based to purpose-driven? Is it that just one day you stop shaming yourself and life gets better? Great question.
Well, first of all, it's a great question, because it starts to lay out an alternative to shame-based behavior, right? So, and most addicts exist in this kind of shame-based place long before they ever probably started acting out. But it's a more purpose-driven, intentional, right, recovery, where we start to be conscious. We're not reacting. I think one of the things about shame and that mindset is that we're almost like puppets to our beliefs and our past and our kind of fears, and we don't really have the ability to be intentional and follow through on it. I think one of the great gifts of sobriety for me was being able to like decide something and work on it and starting to at least make efforts with integrity toward that. So I like the idea of that progression from shame-based to more intentional or purpose-driven behavior. Now, is there a clear line? No, not in my experience. I think it's a gradual process. Just like we didn't learn to become kind of shame-focused people, or we didn't learn our negative core beliefs, all in one moment, but over a period of years, really. I think this transition also happens not over a period of years, hopefully, but it'll happen a little faster. But there's not going to be you don't flick a switch and lose the shame, in my experience, unless there's some very dramatic breakthrough of some kind. But in my experience, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and kind of discovering just my experience. I had certain obvious areas where I was feeling a whole lot of shame in my life. I dealt with those. But what I discovered as I moved forward in my recovery is that I had other little pockets of shame. I thought I'd kind of put shame away. And then there would pop up again in some circumstance or some specific scenario. And so I dealt with it then, right? So I think we have to kind of go through and deal with it kind of a day at a time. And over time it does indeed fade. But certainly my experience was, I don't know, but kind of like a fly swatter. When it popped up after a while, I'd swat it down and deal with it, but not feel like I'd gone back to square one. But it certainly was a gradual transition for me. Scott, what was that like for you?
Oh yeah, I've been in recovery for 22 years. My shame reduction process is ongoing. Every time I think, oh, finally, I've got it all gone, and then something happens, somebody says something.
The universe has other ideas, right?
Yeah. There's always more work to be done, but I've gotten better at recognizing shame and dealing with it when it does arise. In the beginning, I was clueless, and it would just overwhelm me. And I would go into the shame spiral. I don't tend to spin the way I used to, and I suspect that's your experience as well, David.
Totally. Absolutely. Totally. Yeah.
This next question, I'm going to preface it with something I scribbled down to ask, because I think it prefaces this question nicely. Does addict shame and betrayed partner shame look different? And then the question that's asked here is, how does a spouse deal with shame? So how does a betrayed partner deal with shame?
Right. I think the process for dealing with shame are basically the same, right? It's that idea of externalizing it outside of ourselves, where we can get some more objective feedback, and sharing it with other people, giving it away and getting their hopefully support and compassion, but also getting their feedback, and gradually through that feedback starting to correct mistaken beliefs that I might hold about myself or you or somebody else. And so I think that that's the general process. I think that's true for whoever's doing it. We know what the addict shame looks like. I think the partner shame can be a little more complicated because I think there's an obvious source of a lot of the pain, and that's the addict. And so it's easy to focus on that, and rightly so in many ways. I think every human being probably has shame. I think the partner, what I've seen, especially early on, we talk about that roller coaster where people go all over the place, and I think people can be up and down and angry and happy all in the same 24-hour period, and oftentimes that does go some shame as well in there. But generally, I think and Scott, let me know, you may or not have the same idea. I think oftentimes the flavor of a partner shame is different than the addict. It's just because they're not dealing with the pain of such betrayal of someone else. I think that's a whole different animal sometimes.
A lot of times partners will take on shame that isn't theirs. I'm staying with you, there must be something wrong with me, kind of a deal. And so I think betrayed partner shame often looks different around the infidelity. I'm going to make a shameless plug for my friend Michelle Mays. On the East Coast, she's a CSAT therapist. She writes a blog. It's on partnerhope.com. She knows more about betrayed partners and partner shame than anybody on the planet. And she explains it beautifully. Please check out her blog, partnerhope.com. Absolutely amazing. And she has a book coming out this fall, which I'll probably do a review of on our website when it comes out, because I've seen it already and it's very good. Okay, there you go, Michelle. Not listening, but I plugged you. When I feel shame, I try and bury it and think, starting from now, I try to bury it and think that starting from now, I'll do better. But that said, I think being curious about it and learning from it would be far more useful. But making that change is really hard to do. Once I've buried it, I don't want to dig it up and look at it later. Are there any tools to stop throwing a tablecloth over it in the first place? Another great question.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people throw more than a tablecloth over this. They bury it under tons of soil and dig it out in the backyard. So yeah, so I think, first of all, great recognition of just what is our natural tendency when we're feeling this about ourselves, to not feel it. And so that's really the classic definition of addiction. So we bury it, we disconnect from it, we camouflage it, we project it onto somebody else, we do all kinds of stuff with it except feel it. So it's good for you. But I think, first of all, again, in that spirit of being compassionate with ourselves, right, you're doing what almost is instinctive, that kind of bearing things. So don't judge yourself too much about that. And you have the awareness that, okay, it's a much better thing to deal with this and process it. I think there's a couple of things. One is to really understand, what are your defenses against shame? How does that look for you, right? And so some people get very shy. Some people deflect their eyes downward. Some people get red. There's all kinds of expressions of shame. Some people get angry as a way of not feeling the shame. So they're going to get angry and project it outward. So first of all, understanding your own kind of unique constellation of how shame looks, and then really starting to attack it, point by point. In my experience, unless I'm doing some really deep work at a retreat or something, processing shame and doing what you're doing, kind of not throwing a blanket over it, but really looking at it, occurred on a day-to-day basis when opportunities came up, when it arose. So I kind of looked when shame showed up in my life, as it often did. I would take that as an opportunity. Okay, what's that about? What's going on there? And I think that was the only way I could do it. Just as it came up, I dealt with it. And then, as opposed to one major, let's deal with this right now. So I would encourage you to be open to the process and just look at it. again, we've said this probably 20 times tonight, but I think it's really important. We can't do this by ourselves. You need to be able to process these feelings with your sponsor or your therapist, and hopefully your spouse as well, and just build those kind of connections. And we have to in many ways, we have to kind of rewire our thinking, because we have been, shame is an integral part of our software, if you will, kind of guiding how we think about ourselves. And so we have to kind of rewrite some of that stuff. So tools like affirmations are really useful, I think. Gratitude lists, all that stuff that kind of is a kinder, gentler approach to dealing with some of these really painful things. But for me, it was a practice, and a practice of dealing with it and kind of addressing it when it popped up. And that was, I'm also many years in recovery, and it still does, right? And I still look at that, and gradually the circumstances where they are triggered have, diminished, but they're not gone. So it's always useful to deal with it. But I would say a day at a time, process it and use all the tools you already have probably for your recovery, with those with connections and step work and reflection and all that.
Thank you, David. This next question is from sex and porn addict who's 18 months sober but still struggling. He says, I had a strict upbringing with little positive reinforcement, encouragement, or attention, which I craved as a young child. This has resulted in me seeking attention through sex and pornography as a teenager and adult. But I can't identify the shame that goes with this from my child perspective. Why is this? Am I hiding / bearing something to protect myself?
Wow. Yeah, boy, great questions, including this one. It's hard to say because there's so many individual circumstances that can affect this. The way you describe it is classic, right? Seeking attention, often validation from the acting out behaviors, and some of the really power and control that goes with that as well. But when we can't identify the source of shame, that's an interesting thing for me, because I think then that's a little thread that I kind of want to pull on as a therapist, because I think there is a source there. And so at least my belief is that there is something that caused this, because again, no kid is born with shame, right? Somewhere you learned that, or you concluded that about yourself based on circumstances. Maybe nobody ever told you those words, but you learned it somehow. And so I think what I can recommend, and I'm a therapist, so of course I'm going to recommend this, but I would recommend therapy, because I think there's some kind of maybe something back there. It's very common for kids not to remember pieces of their childhood or whole big chunks of their childhood, right? When we have a client who, has no memories before the age of 6, well, kids should have memories before the age of 6, and when they don't, they're probably have been repressed. So you might want to do some trauma work, or look at that, or if you're seeing a therapist or CSAT, talk to them about this, because this is not an unusual scenario, but I guarantee there's probably something there. And you may never know, by the way, the whole story, like where this whole thing came from and all its bloody detail, but you can get a handle on it. And there's no reason you have to continue to live with this like ambiguous shame, right? And there's no reason for that. And so if nothing else, in therapy, we don't always have to know the sources. A lot of the trauma therapies address trauma just by dealing with the reaction and the feeling, right? You don't even have to know everything that happened to you. That's kind of the wonderful thing about trauma therapy. And so I think you may never know what happened to you. It may be beyond your memory, and it just wasn't written. The record button wasn't being pushed. But that still doesn't mean you can't react in a very positive and beneficial way to trauma therapy to get rid of that shame. Also, I know I'm talking a lot tonight, dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, is all based on skills and other kinds of practical tools that are very effective, whether we understand why we need to do it or where that problem came from or not. And so things like DBT might prove useful for you in terms of getting rid of the shame. And opening up that space. But I would say start with trauma therapy, ask your therapist about DBT, and see where that goes. But there's a reason for it. It's just you're for whatever reason disconnected from it. but I think you could find out.
Yeah. Can shame from erectile dysfunction drive a man to emotional affairs and addiction? And by the way, can addiction drive a man to erectile dysfunction? That's a whole other question, which we've covered
Right.
before, and the answer is yes. But I'll turn it over to Dave.
Yeah, we know that erectile dysfunction is a very common issue with especially excessive porn use and sex addiction for both psychological and biological reasons in that regard. You know, my answer to this, or my gut feeling on this question is like, no. I think sometimes this kind of has a little bit of a feeling of a rationale or excuse to me. But I think, you know, people have emotional affairs and act out in addiction because they're addicts. And I probably think the source of those are broader than just having erectile difficulties. I know that the erectile difficulties often, as Scott just said, happen after the others. They come later, right? They're not necessarily the cause. Now, do we get shame? I'm a man. If I have erectile dysfunction, of course I have shame, but I don't go out and have affairs about it. I go to a doctor, or I talk to my therapist, or I see what's going on. But I think that may be a little bit too simplistic for me.
Yeah. All right, we got 2 minutes left. Let's try one more quick one. Hello, Dr. Fawcett. Attending 12-step groups has helped me to reduce my shame, so much so that I sometimes accidentally tell other people that I'm a sex or a porn addict in social settings like work, etc. Is there a concern with reducing shame too much and becoming shameless so that you forget boundaries? Or maybe I'm just evangelical about addiction, so I forget that some things need to say in a 12-step group, or at least be a little more less obvious about it. So yeah, can you reduce your shame too much?
Yeah, and I think you answered your own question here too, by the way. I think I like people. I prefer that people kind of get rid of the kind of what John Bradshaw back in the day used to call toxic shame, right? The shame that kind of comes from a bad place and keeps us trapped and feeds our negative ego and all that. And so I think that's definitely there. Can we lose it? I guess, and become shameless? That's not ideal. We talked about shame keeping kind of in recovery, serving as guardrails, if you will, keeping us on the straight and narrow. But I think besides that, you answered it, boundaries, right? We can get rid of our shame. That doesn't mean we become, free spirits in the wind and an open, transparent book out there for everybody to see. That's where boundaries are important. So yeah, we can minimize our shame, but we don't have to go off the rails. And I do think, I think a lot of times, just to your point about telling everybody, in early recovery, people get really enthused, and I think sometimes can overdo the revealing of their status to too many people that really don't need to know. So I always caution my clients to be cautious about who they tell. It's important to tell. They don't have shame about it, but they also need to be thoughtful about the context in which they make those announcements.
Yeah, oversharing is a real thing. There's a difference between being honest and vomiting your honesty all over people who maybe don't want to hear that particular piece of honesty. Reel it in. But yeah, there's a couple questions left. I'm going to save these for next week. I promise we will take them right out of the gate next week. So come back and we'll get your questions answered. David, thank you so much. Great topic, great questions today. Anything you want to say to take us out?
Well, also, I just want to say, what great questions. So thoughtful and really cool stuff. But just, yeah, shame is universal, but we don't have to suffer from it in silence, at least, and by ourselves. We can just connect with people, and a lot will be resolved.
Okay, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, David. We'll be back next week, same time, same place. We'll see you then.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.